Okay, testing, testing. Can anybody hear me on this thing? Yes? Does that sound okay? All right, great. Hello, everybody. Welcome to week 4 of our Revelation class. If I seem a little tired and frazzled, I am a 5th grade small group leader for Grace Kids Camp, and so thank you. It is true selfless sacrifice, isn't it? Yeah, just kidding. No, it's amazing. The kids are awesome, but I got a group of particularly squirrely boys who I don't think have ever once walked in a line from place to place. They only run and scatter, and so kind of wiped out, but that's part of the job. All right. Why don't we open with a word of prayer, and then we'll begin. Well, Father God, thank you for bringing us all here this evening. We are so grateful that we can spend time together digging into your word. I'm grateful for the opportunity to do my own research and to learn more about the background that has just enlightened my own understanding of the New Testament. And I'm just so grateful that we have the opportunity to share in that learning together. I pray, Father, that as we conclude the class today, that we would each one of us hear clearly from your Spirit's voice. I pray that I would just disappear, your Spirit would remain, and that each one of us would come away with new insights into your teachings, and that these would be practical and relevant insights into our own faith and into the world that we live in today. So, Father, we pray these things in the name of Jesus. Amen. Amen. It was May of 1453. 1453, the mighty city of Constantinople was under attack by the Ottoman Sultan Mehmet the Conqueror with a multinational army that was storming the gates. Now, the city, Constantinople, which had been the capital of Byzantium, the Byzantine Empire for like 1,000 years, it had withstood countless wars and countless invasions by, there was a crusade that went through there were Vikings that went through there were uprisings in the region, and the so-called Theodosian walls that protected the city of Constantinople had never fallen. After 23 different sieges of the city, these walls had held out. So over 1,000 years, the city had never been breached. It had only been occasionally conquered by some sneaky other tactics. But the walls had held, except there was panic in the city this time. There was one reason why there was panic in the city. It was because this time something was different. Echoing through the streets of Constantinople were the sound of gunpowder cannons. This was the first time that anyone in the world had withstood an artillery bombardment with gunpowder cannons. The Ottomans had them, and the Theodosian walls did not stand up to the attack. And so these walls were crumbling, and the citizens of Constantinople were panicking. Many of them ran into the protective walls of the Hagia Sophia Cathedral. This cathedral was one of the most spectacular church buildings in the entire world, and it was pretty much the largest church building for over a millennium, or almost a millennium. And it had served effectively as the center of Christendom for all the years since 547 AD. This church was the center of it all. We think of St. Peter's Basilica. This was before that and mightier than that in the Byzantine Empire. And so the citizens fled there. Beyond, of course, the divine protection that they assumed that they would receive in a place like that, such a holy site, they also thought that as they fled into this place, they'd be reminded of the power that was on display of the Byzantine Empire. Because the Hagia Sophia had these massive doors which would withstand attack, but beyond that, they also, on the outside of this Hagia Sophia Cathedral, were these symbols that would remind them of who the Byzantines had become. One of these symbols was a three-headed snake statue, which was actually a token of the Greek victory over the Persians at the Battle of Plataea in 479 BC, and that this had been in the Temple of Apollo in Delphi for a while, and now it was on display outside the Hagia Sophia, a token of their dominance even over the Greek world. They also had right outside this cathedral an Egyptian column of the pharaoh Thutmose III, which was at this point in history 3,000 years old already. They had that on display. And probably most importantly, they had a 100-foot high bronze statue of the Emperor Justinian, the Emperor Justinian, and he was riding a horse. And it was a monument. This massive statue was a monument to the unstoppable might of Byzantium, and it was a symbol of God's blessing over this Christian empire. So I'm going to read you some of what 6th century author Procopius, how he described this statue, because I think it's fascinating. He says, the horse faces east, and it's a noble sight. On this horse is a huge statue of the emperor, dressed like Achilles. His breastplate is in the heroic style, while the helmet covering his head seems to move up and down, and it gleams dazzlingly. He looks towards the rising sun, riding, it seems to me, towards the Persians. In his left hand he carries a globe, and the sculptor signifying by this that all earth and sea are subject to him. Though he has neither sword nor spear nor other weapon, except that on the globe stands the cross, through which alone he has achieved his kingdom and his mastery of war. So no wonder these panicked citizens ran into the Hagia Sophia, because they found comfort knowing that this symbol of empire would protect them. It was a physical reminder that their unstoppable empire could not ever truly be threatened by a Muslim king who didn't even honor Christ. They just had to have faith, and they had to wait for God to deliver them. Well, I'm going to read from another excerpt. This is from a modern history by a guy named Roger Crowley, as he describes the fateful events of what happened next. Under repeated axe blows, the 4-inch thick door of the Hagia Sophia shuttered and crashed open, and the Ottoman troops poured into the great building. Above them, the mosaic figure of Christ in blue and gold watched impassively, his right hand raised in blessing, and in his left a book inscribed with the words, "Peace be with you, I am the light of the world." A wail of fear arose from the cowering population as the soldiers burst in. Cries were raised to God, but it made no difference. They were trapped as in a net. There was little bloodshed. A few who resisted, and perhaps some of the old and infirm, were slaughtered, but the majority surrendered like sheep. The Ottoman troops had come for plunder and profit. They ignored the screaming of men, women, and children as each soldier struggled to secure his own prize. Young women were almost torn apart in the race to secure the most valuable slaves. Nuns and noble women, young and old, masters and servants, were bound together and dragged out of the church. This was the fall of Constantinople, May 29th, 1453. And from this point on until the early 20th century, Constantinople, or Istanbul as it later became known, was the capital of the Ottoman Empire. For the most part, a Muslim empire. And the Hagia Sophia Cathedral was converted into a mosque, which it remains to this day. Now it's a museum/mosque, but it's still a functioning mosque. And I had the opportunity to visit it last year. I got to go into the Hagia Sophia, and I can tell you, it is truly a spectacular building. I understand why people considered it one of the wonders of the Byzantine Empire. And yet, I'll tell you, seeing the Arabic lettering everywhere in this building and hearing many Muslims praying in what was once a holy Christian cathedral is a sobering reminder of the big idea for basically the rest of this class, which is this: putting our trust in human empires is very, very risky for those who claim to be citizens of heaven. Putting our trust in human empires is very, very risky for those who claim to be citizens of heaven. Okay, so with that sobering intro to the class, which probably yet again you're thinking, what does this have to do with Revelation? I'm sure you by now are kind of putting the lines together here. We are going to conclude this class by essentially looking at one final time at John's warning to his readers, to the church, and his encouragement to the church. And we're going to hopefully be able to apply it at least a little bit to our own cultural moment. We're going to talk about some of the key images from the last the latter chapters of Revelation, like the prostitute of Babylon and the new creation. And we're going to talk finally about my theory that I've hinted at throughout this class, that the Roman Empire never actually went away. So I'm going to explain that finally, and we'll get into that. So let's talk real quick about what we've covered so far. Some major points to remember from this class that I think will be good to refresh as we go into this final week. Number one, let's remember that John was writing to churches in a very specific social location. It was the late 1st century AD. We're mostly in the Roman province of Asia, which is today Western Turkey. These were Greek cities that were under Roman rule. And this was at a time when the Roman imperial cult, the worship of the emperors and their families, was in full swing. John, as he writes this letter, has a very specific purpose in mind. He is concerned that his readers he does not want them to compromise with Roman rule or values. He sees it as a very dangerous threat to the church. The way that he describes it in the book, he talks about Rome or the emperor himself being empowered by Satan, right? The dragon who gives the beast his power. John's point is obvious. There is no compromise with the devil. You cannot compromise with Satan and come out unscathed on the other side. Rome, as we saw in week 3, Rome sees itself as the center of the cosmos, as the beginning of the new creation. But John wants his readers to understand, no, Christ is the true center of the cosmos. Christ is the one who is the Alpha and the Omega. The Roman emperor claims to be the Son of God, and John wants everyone to understand, no, that's Christ. He is the Son of God. Rome rules through might and power. Christ rules through self-sacrifice. Remember, the Lion of Judah is a slaughtered lamb. The bottom line point that he makes is that those who follow Christ should be prepared to suffer and die as a living testimony, a martus of this truth. So those are the main points that he wants to get across. And how does he get these points across? He does it through, well, two things. One, apocalyptic imagery. He uses this genre of apocalypse, which is filled with symbolic creatures and scenes which convey spiritual truths that are behind human realities. He's pointing to truths that go beyond our just normal everyday consciousness. For example, the beast from the earth, which rises up and forces everyone to worship the beast from the sea. Well, I put forth the idea, and I think this is plausible, that beast from the earth represents the sort of aristocratic powers of the imperial cult in Ephesus and Smyrna, etc., which forced the people to worship the emperor. I think that's what he's doing there. He's using imagery to convey concrete ideas. But it's not just through apocalyptic imagery. As I've returned to many, many times in this class, John is a Bible nerd. And so much of his language and ideas and literature comes from concepts that are directly out of the Hebrew Bible. He's making constant references to prophecies and narratives and images from the Old Testament. And so, as I've said a couple times in this class, I think the best tool that we can have to understand the meaning of this apocalyptic imagery in Revelation is not some kind of code book, but the Old Testament. That's the best tool we can have. When we understand that, suddenly Revelation comes into new focus. Bottom line, the book of Revelation depicts the church's struggle against the powers of this world in a way that echoes across the generations. He's talking to his readers in the first century, but he's not just talking to them. He is conveying truth that should still be relevant to us today. And that's why we read this with what we've been calling a theopoetic approach, where we're not just looking at Revelation for historical stuff, we're not just looking at it for future fulfillment, we are looking at it as a depiction of the church's struggle against the powers of this world at all times, in all generations. Okay. So we're going to take all those threads now, and we're going to try to tie them together with this final image that really depicts the power of Rome, this prostitute of Babylon. So if you want to read with me, I'm going to be in Revelation 17. It'll also be up on the screen. But here we go. Revelation 17, verse 1. This is this is where John goes with his prophecy. One of the 7 angels who had poured out the 7 bowls came over and spoke to me. Come with me, he said, and I will show you the judgment that is going to come on the great prostitute who rules over many waters. The kings of the world have committed adultery with her, and the people who belong to this world have been made drunk by the wine of her immorality. So the angel took me in the spirit into the wilderness, and there I saw a woman sitting on a scarlet beast that had 7 heads and 10 horns, and blasphemies against God were written all over it. The woman wore purple and scarlet clothing and beautiful jewelry made of gold and precious gems and pearls. In her hand she held a gold goblet full of obscenities and the impurities of her immorality. A mysterious name was written on her forehead, Babylon the Great, mother of all prostitutes and obscenities in the world. I could see that she was drunk with the blood of God's holy people who were witnesses for Jesus. I stared at her in complete amazement. Okay, so who is this prostitute of Babylon? Sometimes referred to as the whore of Babylon, but let's just say prostitute. She is a woman in the wilderness, as John describes her, which I think is a pretty clear callback to another woman that we last saw in the wilderness. Do you remember who that was? That was the woman with the clothed with the sun and the stars around her head, the woman that represents the people of God. There's 2 women. They're both in the wilderness, but one of them is in hiding, and the other one is drunk on the blood of God's people. So this is clearly tapping into the Hebrew Bible's love of dichotomies. Read the book of Proverbs. There's the virtuous woman and the woman of sin, and you got to make a wise choice which one to follow. This is a motif from Scripture. So all that to say, we are primed to see this prostitute of Babylon as symbolic of a group of people. Just like that other woman was symbolic of the people of God, this woman is symbolic of another group of people. So who? Well, again, lots of theories, but I'm just going to go ahead and cut to the chase with the one I think it makes the most sense, which is I think she represents the people or the city of Rome, the city of Rome itself, especially the aristocracy, the senators, the priests, the patricians, etc. So here's why I say that. Here's why I think she is the Roman people in Rome itself. For one thing, she is seated on a scarlet beast, and obviously that is the beast that we read about earlier. That is the beast from the sea. And so she's sitting on, empowered by, in another sense, the beast, which, as we've already covered, is likely the Roman emperor, or the role of the Roman emperor. So that's where she's getting her power. She's wearing clothes that are have purple and red, and in ancient Rome, those who were of having power, those in the aristocracy, wore robes that had purple or red hems, and so I'm sure that's a reference to that. And then, of course, there's this in verse 9, the 7 heads of the beast that she's sitting on represent the 7 hills where the woman rules. Rome famously, throughout time, has been known as the city of the 7 hills. If you look at a map of Rome, you see those 7 hills that are the sort of the most prominent in Rome itself. It's been known from antiquity as the city of 7 hills. I don't think that's a coincidence. And so this woman is given power by the beast, the emperor, but she is distinct from the emperor. She's not just the emperor, and so I think she represents something broader. I think she represents, like I said, the city or the people of Rome. In the Old Testament, the Hebrew prophets often depict God's judgment over capital cities personified, and they're often personified as unfaithful women or prostitutes. For example, Ezekiel 16 does the exact same thing with Jerusalem. Jerusalem is an unfaithful prostitute that's deserving of God's judgment. That's just kind of how they did it. Additionally, Rome was often personified as a goddess named Roma, or literally Rome. So there's a goddess named Rome that was depicted in Roman art. It was thought of as the sort of the goddess that was the city and was worshipped as that. For example, when we talked 2 weeks ago or 1 week ago about the imperial cult, and we talked about how there was the original imperial cult temple in Pergamum. That Pergamum temple was a temple to Roma and Augustus. Okay, so the temple was to Roma and Augustus, the goddess city of Rome and the emperor himself. So that's who it was. All that to say, all the indications to me point to this woman representing Rome itself. I could be wrong. I've said it a billion times. I could be wrong. So if she's Rome, then why is her name Babylon the Great? I think that's a worthy question to talk about. Well, in the Hebrew imagination, the Hebrew biblical imagination, Babylon is a pretty clear symbol of basically the arch enemy of God's people, basically throughout the Hebrew Bible. You see Babylon show up as kind of the ultimate bad guy for a pretty clear reason. Most of the scripture that we have reached some form of its later form in the exile in Babylon. And so the people who brought the Bible to bear in the world were the people who most suffered at the hands of Babylon. But you can see that conflict reaching back really, really far. Babylon, by the way, has actually showed up a couple times in the history of humanity. The old Babylonian Empire went all the way back to the 19th century BC. So we're talking like almost 4,000 years ago from today. The Neo-Babylonian Empire, though, the one that actually took the Israelites into exile, was closer to the 7th or 6th century BC. And that's like I said, when the exile happened. But if you read the book of Genesis, even there, Babylon is depicted as sort of this, the archetype of human depravity. It's the place where the Babel Tower is built, and it kind of like represents rebellion to God. So this is all through the Hebrew Bible. And so when you get to the New Testament imagination, this isn't the only place you see this, you get a sense of Rome as sort of a new or a completed Babylon. It's like the worst, most complete fulfillment of Babylon. And think about it, it makes sense. Both of these, in their respective times, were global superpowers. Both of them were economic powerhouses. Both of them, Babylon and Rome, both destroyed Jerusalem and the temple in Jerusalem. Babylon in 586 BC and the Romans in 70 AD. And in both cases, we have scriptural texts that talk about the danger of assimilation. Assimilation with these empires is seen as a threat to the people of God. I mean, read the events of the book of Daniel. That's exactly what they're talking about. If you assimilate with Babylon, you will be unfaithful to Yahweh. So as with so many other images in the book of Revelation, this woman, this prostitute of Babylon, I see her as a multi-layered symbol which has its basis in a historical empire, Rome, but it telescopes out. It telescopes back to Babylon. It telescopes forward to all future human empires. What she represents is human empire personified. So we're looking back, we're looking forward. She is a multi-layered symbol. And so John, by depicting her in this way, he is presenting a very clear warning to his readers. The prostitute of Babylon, this archetype of human empire, is drinking your blood. She's drinking your blood. You must not come under her spell like so many others. Why? Because she is destined for destruction. She's destined for destruction. So let's read a bit about that and how that begins. Skip down to verse 15 if you're following along. Then the angel said this to me: the waters where the prostitute is ruling represent masses of people of every nation and language. The scarlet beast and his 10 horns all hate the prostitute. They will strip her naked, eat her flesh, and burn her remains with fire. For God has put a plan into their minds, a plan that will carry out his purposes. They will agree to give their authority to the scarlet beast, and so the words of God will be fulfilled. And this woman that you saw in your vision represents the great city that rules over the kings of the world. All right, so let's take just a second here. What is John trying to convey about Rome or about empire as he describes the beast sort of turning on her? Well, first, let's talk about this image of waters. He mentions a couple different times in what we've read these great waters that she rules over. Well, the waters are most likely an image for great rivers. Almost all of the major human empires that we see opposed to the people of God in the Bible are on major rivers. You've got Egypt on the Nile. You have Assyria on the Tigris, Babylon on the Euphrates. You've got Rome on the Tiber. Each one of these different cities had a major river flowing through it. Without getting too nerdy, there's a reason for this. I think maritime empires had yet to become, until Rome, we'll get to that later, but maritime empires were not really where the wealth was. Where the wealth was for most of the time BC was in rivers which you could use to irrigate vast amounts of crops. That's where you got wealth. Compare that to the relative scarcity of water in the Judean hillside, where the Israelites had to depend on God for rain. That was the way that they got their crops. Whereas Nile, the Euphrates, the Tigris, they could channel the river. They could do great works with these rivers to be able, with their own power, to be able to meet their own needs. This is a really deep layer in the symbology of the Old Testament. But regardless, that's what this means. Rivers were consistent water that human ingenuity and power could harness to provide for human needs. And that's why they had so much incredible wealth. Just for what it's worth, again, John's a Bible nerd. I'm just going to read this passage, which is clearly part of the background of this talking about waters, from Jeremiah 51. The Lord, and it's about Babylon. The Lord has both planned and done what he spoke concerning the inhabitants of Babylon. You who live by mighty waters, rich in treasures, your end has come. The thread of your life is cut. Okay, so that's the waters. I also want to point out what John says here in verse 15, that the waters represent masses of people. What does that mean? Well, he mentions different letters, different words here. In the NLT, it's kind of lost, but he has 4 different Greek words to describe these masses of people. Laos, peoples, oklos, multitudes, ethnos, nations, and glossa, which means languages. And basically what he's doing is he's describing everybody. This is just, he's overdoing it with his different vocabulary to be able to describe humanity. This woman sitting on the beast on the 7 hills, she rules over the kings of the world. This is not just a kingdom, it's an empire. Okay, that's the definition of an empire, is king of kings. When a king rules over other kings, it's an empire. Okay, so now let's talk about this beginning of her destruction, or her demise. It's really fascinating to me the way that John describes the beast itself being the cause of her demise. The beast is devouring her. The beast hates her. Well, there is a very, very clear parallel between this passage and something that we read in Ezekiel 23. Again, have I mentioned John's a Bible nerd? Have I said that? He is. And obviously Ezekiel was his favorite book. So again, read Ezekiel sometime and then read Revelation, and you'll get all kinds of new connections. But there's this passage in Ezekiel 23. It's an allegory about Jerusalem, and but Jerusalem is being represented by, you guessed it, a woman named Oholibah. And I don't know a ton about the passage, so I'm not going to go too deeply, but it's worth reading and just recognizing all the parallels here. He says, "For this is what the sovereign Lord says," this is from Ezekiel, "I will surely hand you over to your enemies, those you loathe, those you rejected. They will treat you with hatred, and they'll rob you of all you own, leaving you stark naked. The shame of your prostitution will be exposed to all the world. You brought all this on yourself by prostituting yourself to other nations, defiling yourself with all their idols. Because you have followed in your sister's footsteps, I will force you to drink the same cup of terror she drank." So, if you hold up what we just read about the prostituted Babylon and this parable of Jerusalem, what you see is the same thing. Both women will be hated, stripped of their clothes, robbed, mutilated, and consumed by fire. So that's nice for them, but whatever. Anyway, this is a clear oracle of destruction. It's a prophecy that falls into a category of an oracle of destruction, which is very common in the Old Testament prophets. But I think there's another layer to this. So yes, he is saying, Rome, your days are numbered. The human empire represented by this woman will come to an end. But there's a deeper layer here, because, like I said, it's not just that this empire is going to be destroyed by external enemies. It's being eaten from within. I find that so fascinating that the beast, the emperor, is the one that is consuming and doing damage to the people of Rome. Well, a little bit of history. From the very beginning of the Roman Empire, emperors always had a really hostile, I'll call it, relationship with the people of Rome and with the aristocracy. And it makes sense because they had to it was kind of a cutthroat world, and if they didn't defend their power, if they didn't snuff out their opposition, then they might be overpowered, they might be cast out of their role, etc. So there's a lot of getting in bed with one another. The emperor often had to get senators on his side, etc. But for the most part, these senators kind of had this love-hate relationship with the emperor. They were made wealthy by the emperor and powerful by their association with him, but they were also completely at the mercy of the emperor's whims. And we see so many times stories of the emperor just flat out just killing people because he wanted to. Or arranging for someone to be forced into doing a suicide, or they'd force people to marry people they didn't want to marry. And it was just like they had just complete power. And probably the most extreme example of this was one called Caligula. Maybe you've heard that name before, Caligula. His real name was Gaius. Caligula literally means little boots. Which is this doesn't matter, but it's Little Boots. I just find that he's got such a diminutive name because he was the son of Germanicus, who was like going to be emperor but wasn't, and he went off he was fighting the Germans, and Little Boots was the little son of this general who wore little boots and a little military outfit and went out on campaign, and the soldiers loved him, and they all knew that one day he would be the emperor. So Little Boots became emperor, and then he basically just was the most awful possible person. I mean, he would constantly, intentionally disrespect people of distinction. In public, he would do things that would humiliate them. He would just talk trash about leading figures. He would show his power by forcing them to do humiliating things. He would launch these treason trials against the Senate. He even would force some senators and equestrians, kind of the knights of Rome, to fight in the arena as gladiators. Like that was for the entertainment of the populace. Think about that. So again, that reminds me of that Lord Acton quote, "Power tends to corrupt. Absolute power corrupts absolutely." Well, that's exactly what happened with Little Boots. He got completely corrupted by his power. He didn't reign very long, but he caused massive damage to the people and the aristocracy of Rome. So again, this woman on the beast, this beast is not to be tamed, and this beast will cause her harm. She should not be surprised that this beast that gives her power is also one that can overpower her. Yet again, John's warning to Rome, and then by association, all who would want to be a part of Rome, is pretty clear. Look, don't get on board this sinking ship. If you get on board this sinking ship, Rome's days are numbered and yours will be too. That's his warning. So the prophecy, the oracle of doom is out there that this empire is going to fall. But with the fall of a massive empire come a lot of knock-on effects. There are a lot of different types of people who are going to be affected by this development. And so John continues in his oracle to describe the different categories, 3 different categories of people who are going to be devastated by the fall of Rome, aka the destruction of this woman, the downfall of the beast, okay? So chapter 18, John begins to talk about these categories of people. So we'll start with verse 7 of Revelation 18. He says, "She glorified herself and lived in luxury. So match it now with torment and sorrow. She boasted in her heart, 'I am queen on my throne. I am no helpless widow, and I have no reason to mourn.' Therefore, these plagues will overtake her in a single day. Death and mourning and famine. She will be completely consumed by fire, for the Lord God who judges her is mighty. And the kings of the world who committed adultery with her and enjoyed her great luxury will mourn for her as they see the smoke rising from her charred remains. They will stand at a distance, terrified by her great torment." So who are these kings? Well, these kings are those, first of all, kings, those who challenged Rome were crushed, but those who got into bed with her got to enjoy her luxury and her power. That's just the basic truth. If you were a king in the ancient world or the ruler of a people group and you got into bed with Rome, things were going to go great for you. And if you tried to stand up to Rome and challenge her, you were going to be ground into dust. Okay, some examples of how this kind of played out that have come up and kind of stood out to me in relation to the book of Revelation. In 133 BC, the ruler of the region of Pergamum, ruling from Pergamum, was a guy named Attalus III, and he died without an heir. And so what he chose to do for the sake of his city was to actually give Pergamum, the city-state, to Rome, like in his will. And so he did that. Pergamum became Roman property, basically. And from that point on, Pergamum was where a ton of the wealth from Asia Minor began to flow into Rome. Roman influence began to flow into Asia Minor. And as we saw later, is the place where the Roman imperial cult, the provincial Roman imperial cult, was founded. It was the first place where that temple of Roma and Augustus was made. And so it's no surprise to me, with a city that was given to Rome and became the epicenter of Roman power before Ephesus became the capital, that city would be called by John the seat of where Satan has his throne, right? We talked about that in week 1. So that's what happened with Pergamum. The kings of Pergamum got in bed with Rome, and things went great for them. On the other side, we can look at the stories of the conquests of Gaul by Caesar. If you remember a little bit of the history, we covered Julius Caesar spent 10 years as the governor over Gaul, and he was constantly at war with the barbarian tribes there. And over the course of those 10 years, reportedly over 1 million people perished in those conflicts. And just keep in mind, this is the ancient world. 1 million people, it would be like talking like 1 billion people today. I don't know, I made that up, but it's a lot. It'd be a shocking amount of people for the number of people who were even alive at that time. So one of the I think battles that I find so fascinating, there was this Gallic barbarian chief named Vercingetorix. I think I'm pronouncing that right. And he was probably the closest anyone ever got to defeating Julius Caesar, because they had this big battle and Julius Caesar ended up besieging the city, one of the Gallic cities where Vercingetorix was holed up, and then the Roman army itself got besieged. Actually, it might have been that Vercingetorix came to relieve the city, and so he and his army besieged the Romans who were besieging the city. So the Romans suddenly were basically surrounded. They're still fighting the guys coming from the city, and they're fighting the guys that are surrounding them, and they managed to win. They were massively outnumbered, and yet they, because of Julius Caesar's strategy, and their will and their complete inability to surrender, they just won the day and completely, officially demolished the Gallic resistance. And so 51 BC is when that happened. And I tell you that because within 1 century of that Gallic resistance and the Battle of Alesia, as it was called, within 1 century, the Gauls rulers went from these vicious, long-haired barbarians to, and I'm not joking, Latin-speaking, toga-wearing, emperor-worshipping client kings. Okay, that's what happened to Gaul as they got crushed under the boot of Rome. There was a city called in Gaul, Lugdunum, which is modern-day Lyon. And Lugdunum was kind of the capital of one of the territories in Gaul. And they built an altar to, guess who? Roma and Augustus in 12 BC. It was inaugurated in 12 BC. And noblemen from over 60 different Gallic tribes flocked to its opening. So I tell you that to say, they tried to put up a fight, got demolished, and the moment they got into bed with Rome, things started going really, really well for Gaul. So much so that eventually, skip forward another 80 or 100 years, and you actually have Gallic senators in Rome. It's wild. It's crazy that would happen. Okay, another example, Cleopatra and Egypt. We won't go over that whole story, but she literally got in bed with Julius Caesar and then later with Mark Antony after him. And basically what she was trying to do, she was the last of the Ptolemaic dynasty, and she really wanted to consolidate her power by getting in bed with the biggest dog in town. And it worked until she died because she chose to be with Mark Antony instead of Augustus. Long story short, she died. So, killed herself. Doesn't matter. All right. That's just another example. But here's one that is interesting from a biblical standpoint, Herod the Great. Herod the Great. I don't know if we often think about how deeply he was intertwined with Rome, but he was. His father, first of all, had really good relations with Julius Caesar. And so Herod, even when he was a really young man, was actually appointed the provincial ruler over Galilee in 47 BC. And so Herod, young man, he's ruler over Galilee. And then the Parthians, a.k.a. the Persians, invaded and actually spent about a year or so ruling over Judea. And during that time, Herod went to Rome pleading for help. And I don't really know the details, but somehow, unexpectedly, he came back having been appointed as the king of the Jews. So he was given Roman Roman power as a client king and an army to be able to defeat the Parthians, and that was how he became the king of the Jews that we read about in our birth stories of Jesus. It was Herod who because of Rome, was able to rule in Judea, even though he wasn't even really Jewish. It's kind of crazy. So, okay, it pays to be friends with Rome. That's my point. All right. Bottom line, these kings, all these kings who bent the knee to Rome could bathe in her power, because that's what we're talking about here, really, power. The world's authority structures aligned to her glory. And Rome's destruction is a symbol, in my opinion, in John's book, for the collapse of human dependence on power and violence and might. And so no wonder these kings are mourning because of what they've lost. All right, so let's move on to the next big category of people, the second category of people who are devastated by the fall of Rome. Verse 11. The merchants of the world will weep and mourn for her, for there is no one left to buy their goods. She bought great quantities of gold and silver and jewels and pearls, fine linen, purple, silk, and scarlet cloth, things made of fragrant fine wood, I don't know what that is, ivory goods, and objects made of expensive wood and bronze and iron and marble. She also bought cinnamon, spice, incense, myrrh, frankincense, wine, olive oil, fine flour, wheat, cattle, sheep, horses, wagons, and bodies. That is, human slaves. Then he kind of shifts to some oracle of destruction. The fancy things you loved so much are gone, they cry. All your luxuries and splendor are gone forever, never to be yours again. I love just how long that list is of stuff. There's so much stuff there, and that is completely on purpose. So the second big category of people who are mourning the destruction of Rome are merchants. Bottom line, those seeking to be wealthy found their path to wealth in Rome. And we know that from the archaeological record, because goods and products from all over the Roman Empire flowed into Rome to enrich her people. There's this crazy development that happens around the time of Julius Caesar and Augustus in the Bay of Naples, which Naples, we all know that's like kind of south of Rome a ways. And we don't all know that. I didn't know that like 6 months ago, but now I do. Naples is over there. They had that was like, Rome didn't have like a big port, so Naples was kind of its port. And so all the wealth from the world was flowing in through Naples, and it also happened to be a really beautiful, scenic bay. And so all the aristocracy would build their summer homes there, or I guess they wouldn't need summer homes. I don't know, whatever. It's beautiful weather. They build their villas there overlooking the Bay of Naples, and they could eat oysters, which were like a delicacy at that time. It was absolutely crazy. That was also the first place we found in the historical record hanging hot tubs. Probably also the last place, because I don't think those keep happening. But there were hanging hot tubs where people could get into these like iron baths and like crazy stuff. Romans loved their baths, all right? They loved their baths. But here's what's crazy. So Naples is kind of emblematic of this wealth that was flowing in. But you also can see the types of things that the Romans are enjoying become wild, and they come from all over the world, including as far as India. Listen to this quote I love from Peter Frankopan's History of the World called The Silk Roads. He says, the poet Martial typifies the internationalism and expanded knowledge of this period. In a poem, mourning a young slave girl, comparing her to an untouched lily, to polished Indian ivory, to a Red Sea pearl with hair finer than Spanish wool or blonde locks from the Rhine. So this is within the imagination of a poet in this same time period. Globalization was, frankly, for the first time becoming a legitimate thing. And wild animals is another example of this, because wild animals were brought to Rome, usually either put into gardens or forced to fight each other to the death for the entertainment of the masses. And here's how Tom Holland in Rubicon describes this. He says, Pompey had filled his theater with wonders from every corner of the empire. Not only lions, tigers, and elephants, but leopards, lynxes, rhinoceroses, and stag wolves, to say nothing of the mysterious Cephas, a creature from Ethiopia with the hands and the feet of a man, so rare that it was never seen in Rome again. Any ideas what Cephas might have been? Nobody knows. Possibly baboons? They think baboons, and I think it's probably baboons, but that's crazy. There were literally sub-Saharan African creatures that were finding their way into Rome itself. Wild. But while we're talking about wealth, we have to talk about the sort of economic foundation of all of that wealth, which is the fact that it was maintained at a terrible cost: slavery. Slavery has been a part of the world, had been a part of the world for forever, but it became kind of a uniquely horrific and widespread reality in ancient Rome. There are some estimates that up to a quarter of Rome's population, the city of Rome's population at one point, was enslaved. They worked in the mines, they worked in the farms, they were galley slaves. I don't think we think about this enough. Most of the time when we picture ships going around the Mediterranean, we think of sails, right? Because they did have sails, and that totally is true. But most of the power that they used to get around and to navigate and to fight was with massive amounts of slaves down in the galley using oars. And they had, like, have you heard of a trireme? That's a way of describing a 3-level galley, basically. So there's 3 whole layers of guys with giant oars, slaves that are chained to do all of this oaring. Well, the Romans invented something like, I don't know, it's like a pentareme or something like that. They had like a 5-layered ship that they could use with just vast amounts of slaves powering with human labor their ships. Okay, I just thought I'd point that out because I think I don't think I ever really paid as much attention to galley slaves until recently. Okay, so here's a quote about slavery from 55 AD. Seneca says this. He says, "A proposal was once made in the Senate to distinguish slaves from free men in their dress, in like what they wore. It was then discovered how dangerous it would be for our slaves to be able to count our numbers. So they shot down the proposal because they realized, oh wait, if we give all the slaves a uniform, they're going to look around and realize, oh, there's a lot of us and we could probably take these guys on. And they tried a couple times. There were some major slave revolts that almost brought Rome to its knees. Neither here nor there. Some slaves in ancient Rome gained positions of power and some elevated positions, but most of them faced horrible, dehumanizing, just terrible, terrible conditions. One story that has really stuck with me, I just find it uniquely horrifying for a lot of reasons, but Nero, famous Nero emperor, he kicked his pregnant wife to death, as one does if you're a Roman emperor, apparently. But he did that, but then afterwards he regretted it because he loved her. And obviously, but he was obsessed with her look, how she looked, and so they did this search across the Roman Empire, and they found this young slave boy who looked just like her. He was a boy, but he looked just like his dead wife. And so guess what they did? And I'm sorry if this is oversharing. They castrated him, and then they married him to Nero, and he went around everywhere he traveled. He brought this wife of his along with him, and they did a full-on marriage ceremony. This boy got all the honors of being the wife of the emperor. It's imagine having a life that has so little value that they can just do that to you. Okay, I'll give you another quote from Tom Holland. He says, in general, the right of a master to glut his sexual appetites on a slave, rather as he might blow his nose or use a latrine, was taken for granted. It was a perk of ownership, plain and simple. No sense of shame is permitted a slave, as it was said back then. So what I'm trying to get across here is that the time of Rome was a time of unparalleled wealth. It absolutely had never been seen before. The kind of staggering wealth and riches and luxury goods and all, it was for the whole empire, everything. It was like a rising tide raises all ships. Well, there was a lot of wealth in the empire, but it also came at a time of unprecedented income inequality and abuse of the working class. So bottom line, the globalized empire of Rome created a deep dependence on her wealth. First we talked about power, now we're talking about wealth. Merchants and markets and artisans and farmers and slave traders all had Rome to thank for their success and their affluence. Rome's destruction, then, is a symbol in Revelation for the collapse of human reliance on money or on wealth. Because when humans depend on that, it ultimately leads us astray. Okay, let's look at the final category of people who are affected by Rome's pending destruction. Verse 17. And all the captains of the merchant ships and their passengers and sailors and crews will stand at a distance. They will cry out as they watch the smoke ascend, and they will say, "Where is there another city as great as this?" And then they will weep and throw dust on their heads to show their grief. And they will cry out, how terrible for that great city. The ship owners became wealthy by transporting her great wealth on the seas. In a single moment, it is all gone." Now, that again talks of the globalization and the wealth that was going across, but I think it also hints at another important factor. These captains and passengers, what they represent, those who once feared the dangerous seas could now traverse the chaotic waters with impunity thanks to Roman influence. Okay, so we're going to talk about influence here for a moment. Prior to the Roman Empire, sailing was a very, very dangerous business. Obviously, there's storms, there's the challenges of traversing waters and finding your way to your destination, but probably the most vicious thing out there were pirates who would roam the seas to take all of your things. So it was a massive risk to be in the shipping industry. Plus, it was expensive. There's boats, there's timber, and all of that. But when Rome came along and began to create like a universal empire over the Mediterranean, these challenges, one by one, began to be overcome. Shipping lanes started to become well-traveled and pretty much as well-traveled as the famous Roman roads, which I can't believe we haven't talked about in this class, but they made great roads, all right, so they could get stuff back and forth. Well, the seas became as well-traveled as those roads because piracy was significantly done away with, and they had better ship technology over time, and because they were this vast empire, they had access to wood from all kinds of places that they never would have been able to access before to build these sturdy ships. And so just to kind of give us an example that we might be a little bit more familiar with, just to think about how absolutely crazy it would have been, how different this would have been, let's just think about traveling between Ephesus and Corinth. Okay, because we are familiar with that as we think about the missionary journeys of Paul and that sort of thing. Travel between Corinth and Ephesus was either a significantly long journey over land across the Bosphorus Straits, like all the way across through where modern-day Istanbul is, and then down the other side. There were bandits on the roads. It was a long road to travel. It was expensive to go that way. Or you could go via water and face shipwrecks, piracy, all the stuff that we just talked about. But when Rome came along, they so ordered and brought peace and stability to the region that we see, even just in our own Bibles, the evidence of just a number of different trips back and forth. So for example, we see that Paul sails to Ephesus in late 52 AD from Corinth. Okay, so he was in Corinth, travels to Ephesus. And then a delegation from Corinth gets to Ephesus, we presume sails, but we don't know, gets to Ephesus in 53 AD. And Paul writes 1 Corinthians, which presumably this delegation then sailed back to Corinth to take. Paul sails to Corinth again in what we have a hint of in possibly 53 or 54 AD, which is referred to by some scholars as his short, painful visit. Because he says in 2 Corinthians, "I decided that I would not bring you grief with another painful visit," which indicates that he had been there for a second. So he probably sailed there and sailed back again. Paul then traveled by land around the Aegean to go visit a few more of his churches that he started. But then he goes back. He sails back to Ephesus from Corinth, and then he sails on to Caesarea. And then Apollos arrives in Ephesus from Alexandria, which is in Egypt. And then within just a couple of years, we see this kind of maritime traffic becoming absolutely crazy. It's like the number of ships that would have been taken just to do the things we read about in our Bibles points to all of these things that had changed. And I know what you're thinking, maybe. Shipwreck of Paul. I thought you said these ships were better. Didn't Paul get shipwrecked? Yes, he did, because it still was a dangerous thing to go on the waters. But I think that example is actually the exception that proves the rule. And here's why. Because in the story of Paul getting to his shipwreck, the ships that we see coming and going in that story are wild. We see dozens of ports mentioned. We have mentions of Alexandria, Asia Minor, Crete, Cyprus, and Malta. And we see all of this happening without any record of any other ships crashing in the story. It's just Paul's. So I don't know. All that to say, there's a lot going on. And it was very, very clear that the Romans had mastered the seas. Now, here's what's crazy about all of this. When Rome first started out, when they were first, let's say, battling the Carthaginians in the 3rd century BC, Rome had no maritime knowledge whatsoever. Like they didn't know any, they were from like the hills of central Italy. They didn't know anything about the water. However, by the first century, the Romans were not only dominant across the Mediterranean, they were regularly using their boats to travel across the English Channel and invade the Britons. So, like, they mastered the seas. And so, here's why I think this matters, why I think the maritime imagery that John is using here matters. I think this is a broader spread or indicative of a broader spread of Roman influence across the known world. Because, yes, they were able to travel across the Mediterranean, but think of what that would have meant for people living in that world. They began to have ideas and connections with one another across the Mediterranean. People from Spain and people from Antioch would have rubbed shoulders with one another. These ideas were beginning to spread. We also see that certain institutions began to shift from just urban institutions, like just the something of Ephesus, to provincial institutions, because people were starting to get connected to others in their province and develop a shared identity. Suddenly we have the province of Asia as the way that people are talking about their world. The second century Greek philosopher, Aelius Aristides, he said when he was talking to one of the Roman emperors that Rome had surpassed all former democracies by including the whole world in their government, either as citizens or as those who are governed. Put simply, Rome had brought all the nations that they knew about, at least, together. Even as far off as Germania and India, people were together under this influence of a globalized Rome. The world, as Aristides said, had become like one city. One city. So much so that people from far across the sea, as we just read, will lament at her destruction. Bottom line, the far-reaching Roman Empire had unshakable influence across the known world, right? It's why they say, where is there another city as great as this? Its reputation drew disparate peoples into its orbit and convinced them that they were at the apex of human achievement. Rome's destruction in Revelation is a symbol for the collapse of humanity's trust in the eternal advancement of man-made culture. Influence. Now, although this is just a very brief summary of what we read in Revelation 17 through 18, the picture that John is painting here is pretty clear, in my opinion. The power, the wealth, and the influence of Rome will come crashing down. And with it will come crashing down all of those who hitched their wagon to her. So remember, I said that the book of Revelation serves as a stark warning to the church. Well, here's where John's message gets the most visceral in its context, in my opinion. Now remember, the original audience who first read this were people living in the bask of the glory of, they were basking in the glory of Rome in the province of Asia. They lived in Greek cities that were completely under Roman control. They were not living at the epicenter of the Roman Imperium, because that would have been in Rome, but every part of their lives, in Ephesus, in Smyrna, in Laodicea, every part of their lives was touched by Rome. Roman power played out in the fear and the reverence that citizens in Asia were expected to display. Remember, we talked a couple weeks ago about the crucifixions that were so common. Roman might was enforced by these horrific deaths. Rome's wealth was a constant draw for those seeking to better their circumstances. Remember, in week 3, we talked about all the economic ties that came between worship of the emperor and successful businesses and tax benefits. It all was connected, right? Roman influence gave structure to the social trajectory of people's lives. Remember week 1, we talked about the Nicolaitans and the high-class parties that people would go to that were filled with meat sacrificed to idols and prostitutes. And it was these Nicolaitans who were encouraging Christians to relax and go to these things. And it's okay, it's not a big deal. And that was the world that these people were living in. And remember, in week 3, we talked about how many opportunities were unlocked by the Roman imperial cult, who gave aspiring young aristocrats a new way to make a name for themselves. That was Rome's influence at work. And so we see the effects, in my opinion, of all 3 of these components of Roman rule, power, wealth, and influence, showing up as hints behind the warnings to these 7 churches in chapters 2 and 3. For example, the church in Ephesus is suffering and losing passion. You might lose passion too if you saw all these incredible Roman monuments going up all around you. The church in Smyrna is facing imprisonment and death, according to John. The church in Pergamum, as we already covered, they lost a brother to martyrdom. And I mean, again, are we surprised? That was the city that was the first one to have a province-wide temple dedicated to the emperor. The church in Thyatira is being led astray by sexual immorality and food offered to idols. The church in Sardis is hollow and dying inside. The church in Philadelphia is about to face a time of great testing. And the church in Laodicea is being deceived by its wealth. And if you look at a map of Laodicea, you realize that it is located on a major road that brings goods, a Roman road actually it started as a Persian road, then became a Roman road that took goods from Ephesus all the way to Persia. Although the book is designed to be about more than just the threat of Rome itself, right? It is theopoetic. It goes way beyond just Rome. It is hard to ignore the massive, massive influence that Rome has over the state of the church in Asia Minor. And John is desperate for his readers to demonstrate the power of Christ through their steadfast resistance to the temptations of Roman power, wealth, and influence. He wants them to resist. This is a resistance document. So, I've mentioned John's warning being clear several times. I'm just going to kind of recapitulate the whole warning that he gives that I think is the central message to the church of the book of Revelation. He's basically saying this to his readers: do not bow the knee to Rome. She is destined for destruction. Only those who patiently endure the trials to come and reject the allure of empire will be able to defeat the schemes of the enemy, who wants nothing more than to devour us. Do not bend the knee. She is destined for destruction. That, to me, is the warning of the book of Revelation. It's a deeply provocative and anti-imperial message to its original audience. But I believe it's also a searingly relevant message for us today. Why do I say that? Well, because as I've hinted at, like I said, several times in this class, I believe a pretty simple fact: that the Roman Empire has not yet been destroyed. The beast from the sea has not yet been thrown into the abyss. The prostitute of Babylon is still sitting on its back. So let me explain what I mean by that. And I'm going to use these three categories that we've just talked about, power, wealth, and influence, to do that. So first, let's talk about power. Now, it is true that the city of Rome itself began to struggle with barbarian invasions in the 4th century. In 476, the last emperor of the Western Roman Empire in Italy was deposed by a Germanic barbarian king. Okay, so we do know that Rome itself, the city, did decline. So you might think, okay, well then that's the end of Roman power, right? Not exactly, because in the early 4th century, the Emperor Constantine, we'll come back to him, the Emperor Constantine built the city of Constantinople, named humbly after himself, and he shifted the center of Roman power east. If you look at this map here, you can see that this is what we call the Byzantine Empire. And Constantinople is right there at the top of what is pretty close to Asia Minor. So Constantinople, which was built on the city of Byzantium, is what is the center of power of what we call the Byzantine Empire. But here's the thing. The emperors of Constantinople, the Byzantine emperors, they did not call themselves Byzantines. Do you know what they called themselves? Romans. They called themselves Romans because they, as far as they were concerned, they were the direct continuity of Roman power. Sure, they shifted their capital to Constantinople, but the Roman Empire never went away. It just continued. And so Constantine was a Roman Empire in Rome, and he was a Roman Empire in Constantinople. And they maintained this power, this ideal of the Roman continuity for a further 1,000 years. So just think about that. The Roman Empire continued through Byzantium until, as we saw earlier, 1453, when Constantinople fell, as I opened my opening illustration. But it didn't end there. You might think, okay, well, so 1453, that's when the Roman Empire's power went away. Well, no, because there was another up-and-coming empire, in 1453 that happened to be significantly in the influence sphere of the Byzantine Empire, was a part of it for a while, maintained its connections to the Byzantine church, and that empire took up the torch of Rome and continued to call itself the Third Rome. And you know who that empire was? The Russians. The Russians. They considered themselves to be the successors of the power of Rome. They were the successors of the Byzantiums, and the Byzantines were the successors of the Romans. Now, it is no surprise, or it should come as no surprise, that one of the ruling families of the Roman Empire, of the Russian Empire, went by the name Romanov. It means Roman. It literally is like a connection right back to their heritage as Romans. And guess what they called their rulers? Anybody know the ruler of the Russian Empire? Tsar. It's up on the screen. Yeah, thank you. Tsar. Tsar, which guess where we get the word Tsar? Caesar. It's the Russian word for Caesar. The Russian Empire, until 1917, it ruled 1/6 of the world's landmass, which is arguably more than the Roman Empire did in its official peak. So the Russian Empire considered itself to be carrying on the torch of Rome. But the Byzantine Empire was not the only political force that thought that it was carrying forward the mantle of Roman power, because after central Italy fell into ruins, things kind of got a little dark for a little bit, but then in 800 AD, the Frankish king Charlemagne was crowned as the emperor of the Holy Roman Empire. And this kingdom, which is the kind of the predecessor to many of our modern Central European nations, many of them, also called themselves Roman. They talked about themselves as the successors of Rome. They used symbols like the eagle, just like the Roman legions did when they went into battle. And guess what they called their rulers? Kaiser. You know what Kaiser is? It's a Germanic form of Caesar. You guessed it. They saw themselves as the continuity of Rome as well, which should be no surprise to us because of the way that the Nazis thought of themselves. They thought of themselves, guess what? As the successors to Roman imperial power. They reveled in Roman symbols and iconography. Hitler thought of himself as the successor to Roman imperial power, divinized, and he saw himself as a new Julius Caesar. They also used eagles as symbols of their power and authority. Nazi architects like Albert Speer drew inspiration from Roman neoclassical design. And the Nazis even decided to mimic the Roman salute, a gesture that I will not do, but I will describe and you'll see it on the screen, as a right arm fully extended, facing forward with the palm down. Guess who started that gesture? You guessed it, the Romans. It was theirs. So my point in this is that all these empires or would-be empires, they all saw themselves as the direct successors to Roman power. But this isn't just history. This isn't just history. We can even see the legacy of this torch passing happening today. In February of 22, when Putin invaded Ukraine, his aim, which he has stated clearly, was to retake land that was once a part of the Russian Empire. And journalists have done interviews with him where he has explicitly spelled out that he is trying to recapture the glory of the Russian Empire, which they call the Third Rome. So it's happening even before our eyes. We are seeing the legacy of Roman power continue to draw blood. This legacy of ashes and death and military might, I don't believe that it has ever truly gone away. So that's power. And we can talk a lot more about power, but let's move on to wealth. Well, as I talked before about the globalized economy, all of that, like I said, was made possible by Roman dominance, by Roman engineering, by Roman supremacy. Unheard of luxuries became commonplace for the elite. Now, there has always been vast income inequality in basically every human kingdom or empire throughout all time. That's just kind of the way the cookie crumbles, it seems, in human empires. However, the Roman era, which we talked about before, where there are like rhinoceroses in Rome and Indian fabrics being used in Spain, like this brought a whole new level to what we would think of as a globalized economy, and it unlocked a new level of wealth and prosperity for a far greater number of people. Not only, first of all, did they mine a bunch of precious metals and put them into circulation. I'm sure a lot of the gold we have today started out being mined by a Roman slave. A lot of that was put into circulation. But the Romans also expanded the scope of who could be considered the elite of our world. So think about all these cities. Think about Ephesus, this free city of Rome, which is not Roman. It's a Greek city, and yet now, because of Roman power, there are all these new offices for these young aristocrats to seek. And there are new ways to develop wealth and new opportunities for you to make your money as these merchants across the sea are doing. And so all of a sudden, the elite are not just in the capital. They are all over the Roman Empire. As long as they bow the knee to Rome and to Caesar, they can become fabulously wealthy in ways that nobody had ever even thought possible before. It was the globe was being unified under a new mega economy. And in my opinion, it was an entirely new class of wealth that frankly has echoes throughout Western civilization even today. I mean, just think about our own culture. Think about American culture and our economy as it stands right now. Think about consumerism. It's no longer okay to just accept your lot in life. Like, that is like a cultural given. You are supposed to what? Achieve, overcome, pull yourself up by your bootstraps so that you can become wealthy. That's the expectation of every American citizen. It's a birthright. Where if you went back to ancient Rome, and you ask some commoner on the street, hey, do you want to become an elite someday? They'd laugh in your face because of course not, it's impossible. But then they began to see the Roman Empire spread new ways of making wealth. All of a sudden, a slave could become a freedman who could become a slave owner someday. You could see people who were kind of nobodies becoming equestrians, and suddenly, that's like the knights of that time, and suddenly they find themselves in political office in Pergamum. Like, it was suddenly possible, starting in that day, for people to begin to see themselves breaking free of the molds of what fate had given them or what the gods had given them. And now we think of that as a birthright. Every one of us is told you can be anything you want to be. I think that is a legacy of something that began for the first time in human history under the power of Rome. Let's also talk about the way we talk about our economy and our market. And this is just one of my little bees in my bonnet that I go on about, and no one else seems to ever care, but I'm going to say it because I still think it's fascinating. The way that we talk about our market, the U.S. market, right? We talk about it as if it has a will, don't we? We talk about it as if it has desires, as if it reacts to things. We talk about it in a personified way. In a way, it is really not so different from the way that people in ancient Rome or Greece would talk about the gods that had power over their lives. And what do all of us do as an expectation of our American life? We make sacrifices to that market. We actually make sacrifices from our income. We give to that market in the hopes that it will one day bless us in return. I'm just saying, I'm not like trying to decry retirement savings here. I'm just saying that it is so interesting that doesn't really make us bat an eye at all in our culture. I'm just saying. Okay, another example, income inequality. Income inequality. As the lower and middle classes of America are gaining access to riches that are unthinkable, that would have been unthinkable to the slaves of ancient Rome. And that sounds crazy because we're so convinced of how poor so many people are, and they are relatively. But if you think about the healthcare and the abundant food and the dishwashers and the luxury items that every person is able to have, we are seeing the lowest classes being raised to a level of, frankly, wealth and extravagance that the ancient Romans couldn't have imagined. But at the same time, what is happening now to the upper classes? They are being launched into a ridiculous stratosphere of wealth that we can't even comprehend, right? If the top 100 wealthiest individuals in the world set aside 8% of their net worth, we could solve global hunger like that forever. 8% of the top 100 people in the world. That's the kind of staggering wealth we're talking about. Most of us will probably live long enough to see the world's first trillionaire. And look up a video that describes how much $1 trillion is and tell me that isn't mind-boggling. So that is not a level of wealth that we would have seen in ancient Rome. However, I believe that what Rome began in its concept of a globalized economy where the super rich can become ultra rich and beyond, I think that legacy of their wealth and their view towards it has continued to echo in the hunger that has been developed in humanity for more. We are not satisfied. We are not satisfied. We want more. And that, I think, has been fed into us by this beast that has awakened us to the possibilities that we too could become elite. My point is that the Roman Empire began a new era in human wealth that has never been seen on earth before. And this new relationship that humanity has with wealth has fundamentally changed our world, and we still feel its reverberations today. All right, finally, let's talk about influence. Influence. John depicts an empire that spans the known world and touches the lives of people in vastly different locations and cultures. And these are people all over the world weeping as Rome falls, right? Well, although those direct connections between people around the world, they waxed and waned over the subsequent centuries, the influence of that influence has remained strong in the consciousness of humans. And here's what I mean. More than any other kingdom before it or empire before it, Rome introduced the world to the concept of a global empire. And that concept, that influence of that idea of one ruler or one empire conquering the globe has echoes in the ways that so many of the European imperial powers treated their seagoing adventures. Think of England and France and Spain and Portugal, right? What's the famous phrase that people say about the British Empire? The sun never sets on the British Empire, right? That concept of a global empire, I think it was set off and begun in Rome. In each one of those cases, as these empires spread across the world, just like the Romans, they tried to recapture that unstoppable glory of an unstoppable military force that could bring the light of civilization to the primitive, barbaric peoples of the world. That's how the Romans saw themselves. If you were to just put some statements from Roman, high-minded Roman imperialists up against those from England or Portugal, you would find the exact same type of language. They were out to civilize the uncivilized. Now, before we shake our heads at them and say, oh, those imperial powers, I'm so glad that those are all gone, let's not forget what our country has become since its founding. And I'm sorry, I love our country, but I have to just shoot straight a little bit here. We too have been massively influenced by Rome. We'll start with some of the more neutral stuff, like our architecture. I mean, the architecture of our capital is absolutely designed with Rome in mind. We love to recapture the classics of Greek and Roman architecture that makes us feel like we are a continuity of that ancient past. The founding fathers, they all were reading constantly things like Cicero and Tacitus and Seneca. They got ideas in their head of what human civilization should look like. What does it look like to grow? And we see it reflected in our Constitution. We see these civic structures that are absolutely echoes of the way that Rome, the Roman Republic at least, was structured. Things like separation of powers and checks and balances and term limits and the Senate. We have a Senate just like ancient Rome. And as all human empires tend to do, we also are influencing our world in a way that is not too dissimilar from ancient Rome. I mean, we are leading the charge in globalization, right? We are influencing people all across the planet. We are allowing our values and our economy to shape the global consciousness. We are conquering with both hard and soft power those who would stand against us. And in many ways, the United States has kind of become the new Roman Empire, or at least what I'll say is that we have become at least the new Roman Republic. And if you remember the history that we talked about, the Roman Republic fell when Julius Caesar kicked off the beginning of the empire. So maybe we're not there yet. Maybe we haven't reached Roman Empire status, but we sure are happy as the new Roman Republic. But you know, all right, I made an offhand comment about this in week 1, but I found the quote where I got this from, and I thought I'd share it with you because it's interesting. One example of this is from Michael J. Gorman. One example of the impact that reading Revelation with persons from other cultural contexts can have is the experience of American biblical scholars who have taught Revelation in places like South America and India, where they have often found their students unanimously and unhesitatingly connecting the beast of Revelation 13 to the United States. Ugh. Like, again, that's kind of wild. the allure of a global empire, of a world-spanning influence that we might have, it has never gone away. The influence, at least the influence of Rome, is still affecting our country today. This idea of a global empire, it started with the Persians, it got picked up by the Greeks, and then it was finally established forever in human consciousness by the Romans as a possibility, a real possibility for those with the willpower to take it. The merchants and the travelers from Revelation 18, they asked, where is a city as great as this? And I would just ask, how often have we sought to have the same question asked about the empires of our day? All right, you get my point, all right? I'm getting a little preachy here. You get my point. Roman power, Roman wealth, Roman influence continue to shape our world. Human empires continue to wreak havoc on humanity and draw us into violence and greed and injustice, so much so that when we're in the middle of the new Rome, we often don't even see it at all. Which is why John's warning for his readers in Asia Minor is so stark even today. He's telling them, this is not an empire that you can mess around with. Don't compromise with the beast. Don't get in bed with the prostitute of Babylon. So John wrote that to the church 2,000 years ago. How has the church done at withstanding the allure of her seduction? Let's talk about it. In the early days, the church that John was writing to, and for the next couple hundred years, was an increasingly subversive movement in the Roman Empire. It started out as what people thought of as a Jewish sect, but then it started to be a little different because Jewish people were really not trying too hard to proselytize. They weren't trying to convert other people, but then these Christians came along. And that's exactly what they were trying to do. They were trying to get other people to join their movement, to become a part of what they were about. And so you saw with that growing proselytization, you also saw a growing persecution of the church. We talked maybe last week, I don't remember when, about the great fire in Rome that Nero blamed on the Christians, burned Christians alive as punishment for it. We have tons of records of executions and martyrdoms of all kinds of people in the arenas being murdered by gladiators or eaten alive by vicious beasts, etc., for the entertainment of the masses. So much so that this persecution got so bad that they began to have to worship in catacombs, the places where the dead were buried, because that was the only place that they could find a way to secretly meet and have the body and blood of Christ and be able to meet without the fear of being thrown in jail or killed because of their faith. And yet, as we've talked about, that was also when the church began to spread like wildfire. Because in that heat of persecution, something about that began that this message of Jesus began to spread like crazy. As these martyrs were going to their death singing hymns, seemingly having a supernatural peace about them, other people wanted a part of what they had, and so the church grew like wildfire in Rome. But then, in 312 AD, we come to the Battle of the Milvian Bridge. Constantine was the emperor at this time, and he was just a normal Roman emperor until he had a vision before this battle. What historians think what they think that he thinks he saw was this symbol here, the Chi Rho symbol, which was an early church symbol that represented the Chi symbol in Greek and the Rho symbol in Greek, which mean Christos, C-H-R, basically, Christos. And so apparently the story goes that Constantine saw that symbol in the sky, and he heard or saw the words, "In this sign, conquer." In this sign, conquer. And as luck would have it, he went on to be victorious in that battle, and then that led to him officially converting himself to Christianity. One of his first acts as a Christian was to end widespread persecution against Christians. There were still localized pockets, but he ended empire-wide persecution against the Christians. And then, as I said, he moved the empire's capital over to Constantinople. So from this point on, from the Battle of the Milvian Bridge on, we had a wedding of imperial power and Christian influence. A couple emperors later, in 380 AD, Christianity became the official state religion of Rome. So all of a sudden, the Christians who not that long, like 100 years before, were meeting in catacombs because they were afraid for their lives, are all of a sudden at the top of the heap. The Roman Empire is now a Christian empire, which may seem at first glance like a victory. It might. You might look at that and think, okay, we did it. We did it. We won, right? In this sign conquer, Christos, Christ is on the throne. And yet, let's think about what happened almost immediately afterwards. In the next 100 years after Christianity became the state empire of Rome. First of all, remember me talking about the imperial cult and how being a priest was not like a religious thing. It was like a way to have more power in your society. Well, guess what started happening to Christian priests and bishops? That became an office that people would seek, not because they felt called to the ministry, but because it was a ticket to wealth and influence. They weren't doing it because they were open to suffering and martyrdom. They were doing it because it was their meal train. They could become influential and wealthy. Church buildings, we see this in archaeology almost immediately. Church buildings suddenly became these beautifully well-decorated and magnificently built cathedrals. No more earnest and risky meetings in the catacombs. All of a sudden, we can meet in these gilded palaces with stained glass windows. The Hagia Sophia that I mentioned before was built in the 500s, and that's only like 150, maybe 170 years after this transformation happened. It was one of the most beautiful cathedrals ever built. And then, of course, you began to see that imperial wars started to have the backing of the divine. Remember, in this sign, conquer, that became kind of the headline of what I'll talk about later, what's called Christendom. So in this sign, conquer, all of a sudden the wars against the Goths or the Persians, they were done with the favor of Jesus overlooking them. The Crusades, obviously, it's a perfect example of taking the kingdom of heaven to the enemies of God and destroying them on the earth. I could even make the case, and we don't have time, but I could even make the case that Islam as a religion, it was founded as a result, in the first place, because of the hostile posture of Christian rulers towards Eastern peoples. I could make that case. And so even Islam itself was founded because of this imperial, so-called divinely backed guidance to go and conquer the world. And a little side note in history is as Islam was on the rise and the Byzantine Empire, aka the Romans, were pushing back and going to war and oppressing Muslims, the Muslim peoples went significantly scorched earth on what's called the Church of the East. So essentially, the branch of Christianity, you've heard of Eastern Orthodoxy, but there's an even further Eastern branch of Christianity that was kind of taking root in Persia and in the East and Iraq and all that area. They got completely decimated to the point where they almost completely lost their influence on the world stage. That was a Muslim response to the Byzantine response to the rise of Islam. So it was again, tit for tat, violence leading to more violence, and now we lost an entire branch off the tree of Christianity. I'm just saying. As the leaders of the church over time became enmeshed with imperial power, suddenly the way that they dealt with people on the outside, heretics, let's say, or outsiders, started to kind of ring a little bit of some familiar notes from some of the stuff that we've already talked about, like torture and forced confessions or mass executions, the Inquisition, witch trials, wars between different Christians, right? This is all stuff that suddenly is becoming normal and endorsed by the church-run state. And let's not forget the countless ways that horrific immorality of different kinds just completely crept into the church over the generations as the church accommodated the demands of the empire that we serve. So here's the title of what this entire era of Christianity is called, in my opinion. There's other people who would define it differently, but I think this word fits, Christendom. Christendom, which is when the church holds the power of empire. Christendom. Now, to be clear, I am not saying that there was nothing good that ever came out of this era of the last 1,500 years of church history. I'm not saying that. There have been beautiful things that even were made possible because of the favor of empire, like ecumenical councils, the Nicene Creed, the Council of Ephesus. And these are councils that help us as the church define our core doctrines. And so that would not probably have been made possible if everybody was still meeting in the catacombs. So that's a good thing. There were some empire-wide spread of things like hospitals and healthcare. There were things like the monastic stewardship of key documents during the what is now not apparently allowed to be called the Dark Ages. People don't like that anymore. I don't know why yet. I'm going to figure that out. But the Dark Ages, what we would normally call the Dark Ages, it was the monasteries that were backed by the imperial powers that actually kept these documents alive. Many of the original manuscripts that we have came through that monastic tradition. That was a part of empire. And if we really take a big, huge step back, we can see this shift in global culture towards things like human rights, towards things like humility as a virtue, etc. And all of that, it could be argued, happened more easily because Christianity was essentially the imperial power, because Christians were on the throne. However, as I said before, I think it's very, very risky for the church to get in bed with empire. And I'm not so sure that the benefit is worth the cost. Remember the fall of Constantinople. That's how I started this class. As the Ottoman invaders were bashing in the doors of the Hagia Sophia, the Christians inside cried out to God to save them, but to no avail. Why? Well, I think it's probably because they had built their society not on the sacrifice of the slaughtered lamb, but they had built it on human power and wealth and influence. Think of the symbol of the Emperor Justinian on that massive horse holding the world with the cross as his weapon. In this sign, conquer, it led to them being conquered. They had built an empire of the earth instead of trusting in the empire of the heavens. Which brings us to today. We are a part of the church in America, arguably the Rome of our day, and this is in itself not a problem. To be living in Rome is not a problem. The early church lived in Rome, and they thrived in Rome, even facing the persecution as we talked about. But as the church in Rome, in the Roman Empire of our day, we have some pretty significant questions that we have to ask and answer. Are we leaning on human power? Are we inured to the trappings of wealth? Are we under the sway of our empire's influence? Are we shrugging our shoulders at the assimilation that happens with the powers of our world, like the Nicolaitans? And by the way, when I say that, I don't just mean, free sex and moral decline and that kind. I'm talking tribalism, consumerism, the things that our culture crams down our throat. Are we giving into those things? To put it another way, are we worshiping in the catacombs, or are we luxuriating in the dining halls of the aristocracy? John's warning is clear, and I think we would do well to heed it for ourselves. So that's John's warning for the church. And I think it still carries a lot of weight. This is the kind of thing that we have to go to our rooms and think about because it is intense. It is intense. But I promise that we were also going to talk about John's encouragement, because this is not just a doom and gloom letter that John writes. He does not leave his readers in despair. Quite the contrary. He actually ends his apocalyptic vision with a staggering and joyful vision of new creation, where there is a new empire that's ruling the earth, but it's not the empire of Rome, it is the empire of the heavens, the kingdom of God, ruled by God from a combined heaven and earth. That's his vision, where notably the sea, the ocean, where the beasts emerge, the symbol of chaos throughout the Hebrew Bible, is entirely gone. It's gone because there is no more chaos, and there's no more chaos for future beasts to emerge from. It's gone. His vision is one where the enemies of God's purposes in the world, the beasts from the sea, the dragon, aka Satan, even death and the grave itself are all thrown into the lake of fire to trouble humanity no more. So why don't we do this? Let's read John's vision of what is yet to come, and then we'll talk briefly about it. Chapter 21. This is after all the bad guys have been thrown in the lake of fire. He says this, "Then I saw a new heaven and a new earth, for the old heaven and the old earth had disappeared, and the sea was also gone. And I saw the holy city, the new Jerusalem, coming down from God out of heaven like a bride beautifully dressed for her husband." I think we're meant to imagine that woman that we met earlier, the woman that represents the people of God. I think that's a pretty clear association. Verse 3, "I heard a loud shout from the throne saying, 'Look, God's home is now among his people. He will live with them, and they will be his people. God himself will be with them. He will wipe every tear from their eyes, and there will be no more death or sorrow or crying or pain. All these things are gone forever.'" And then skip down to verse 22. He says, "I saw no temple in the city, for the Lord God Almighty and the Lamb are its temple. And the city has no need of sun or moon, for the glory of God illuminates the city, and the Lamb is its light. The nations will walk in its light, and the kings of the world will enter the city in all their glory. Its gates will never be closed at the end of the day, because there is no night there. And all the nations will bring their glory and honor into the city." Now, we could talk for a while about all the different specific images that John mentions there, but this last little bit I think is really relevant to what we've been talking about today. This idea of all the kings of the earth entering this city with all their glory, all the different nations being represented, streaming to this new Jerusalem and the new creation. John's a Bible nerd, have I mentioned that? In Isaiah 60, we see that exact same vision, and I think Isaiah 60 is a perfect way to end our discussion of John's encouragement to the church. Even though it's not in Revelation, this is the background of what John is saying in Revelation. So I'm going to read some segments from Isaiah 60, which I think flesh out this vision of what new creation will be like. And as I do, I want you to think about two things. One, I want you to think about what we just read in Revelation, this image of the new creation and this being the end where the chaos is gone once and for all, where the beast has been thrown in the sea. I also, though, I want you to think about that moment at the beginning of the class, talking about the fall of Constantinople and the Hagia Sophia and those who had put all their trust in human empires and what happened when the nations came to that holy site. All right, so here I'll read this. "Arise, Jerusalem. Let your light shine for all to see, for the glory of the Lord rises to shine on you. Darkness as black as night covers all the nations of the earth, but the glory of the Lord rises and appears over you. All nations will come to your light. Mighty kings will come to see your radiance. Look and see, for everyone is coming home. Your sons are coming from distant lands. Your little daughters will be carried home. Your eyes will shine, and your heart will thrill with joy. For merchants from around the world will come to you. They will bring you the wealth of many lands. I will accept their offerings, and I will make my temple glorious. I will exchange your bronze for gold, your iron for silver, your wood for bronze, and your stones for iron. I will make peace your leader, and righteousness your ruler. Violence will disappear from your land. The desolation and destruction of war will end. Salvation will surround you like city walls, and praise will be on the lips of all who enter there." I believe that vision of Isaiah 60 is exactly the kind of vision that kept John's hope alive as he wallowed in exile on Patmos. I believe that those images of the nations bringing their best, their glory, their wealth to God in worship, not as enemy combatants, but as worshipers alongside the people of God. I think that is the vision that inspired John to give his final encouragement to the church. And it is an encouragement. It's an encouragement that the end is written. The destiny. Remember we talked about the scroll that the Lamb was worthy to open? That scroll is a representation of God's knowledge of how things are going to go. And what we just read is the end of the scroll. That eventually, someday, we don't know when, new creation will come, and all the nations on earth will worship God together, bringing our very best to him, not out of power or violence, but out of love, and modeling ourselves on the self-sacrificing love of the Lamb that was slain. That's the encouragement from John in Revelation. He's telling, obviously, a massive warning to his churches. Pay attention. Don't get in bed with Rome. It's destined for destruction. But the encouragement is the same. Do ally yourself. Link yourself to the slaughtered Lamb. Follow where he goes, because where he goes is new creation, and you can be a part of it. Now, I want to end this class with one final mental image from my time actually traveling out to Istanbul, Constantinople, Ephesus, and basically walking in the footsteps of John and Paul and all these guys. I had a kind of a profound realization that I think I want to share with you, and maybe consider it my warning and encouragement to kind of be the little echo of John's. So when I was in, obviously I was in the Hagia Sophia, and I was just astounded at the fact that this once great cathedral is now a mosque. And that kind of echoed with me as I went to the Basilica of St. John, which I showed you guys, I think, in week 2 when I talked about John the author. Anyway, the Basilica of St. John is where they think John is buried, and it's just outside of Ephesus. If you're standing in Ephesus and you're looking to where the Temple of Artemis was, there's a hillside, and up on the top of that hillside is where the Basilica of St. John was, where apparently John was buried. And above that is a Byzantine castle. So this basilica was built around the same time as the Hagia Sophia, and it was gorgeous, it was beautiful, it was done in the Byzantine style, it was well decorated, it was incredible. And they used a lot of the stones that they found in Ephesus. They took stones from the Temple of Artemis to build this Basilica of St. John. They took stones from the Temple of the Sebastoi in Ephesus, the temple that was once dedicated to the Roman emperors. Now they're using it to honor John himself. They're using it to build this magnificent church, which will eventually be surrounded by these magnificent Byzantine walls. And it's like a perfect example of human power and divine power mixed as empire and Christianity come together in Christendom. And yet, what did I see when I went to the Basilica of St. John? Ruins. Because that's all that's left. The ruins are just there. There's pillars lying on the ground. You can see the outline of some parts of the building, but there's just really nothing left. And I had a moment as I was walking through the Basilica of St. John where the call to prayer came on. And I could hear it echoing over the city of Selçuk and up the hillside to this basilica's ruins. And it was just a stark reminder of the fact that Christianity allied itself with empire, and all that's left is ruins. And who's ruling now but the Muslims in that area? And so it was a shocking thing. And then I finally, after going to Ephesus and walking the streets of Ephesus, I went to the Temple of Artemis. And as I'm standing in the Temple of Artemis, there's almost nothing left, right? There's like a couple little pillars. There's like a little stone here. There's almost nothing left. They barely could find it. They finally found it. Anyway, so the Temple of Artemis, which once was such a massive part of the city of Ephesus, is now in ruins. And I had a moment, just a little glimmer, thinking of Ephesians 6, where I was like, that's right, Artemis. We beat you. The Christians won, because look, there's nothing left of you now. And then I looked up, and I saw the ruins of the Basilica of St. John. And then I have just recently learned that right at the base of that hill is a mosque that was built with, guess what? Stones from the Basilica of St. John. And I had like an epiphany in that moment where I realized, oh, all of this, when we ally Christianity and our faith with human power and the power of empire, all we end up doing is swapping stones. That's all we're doing. We're swapping stones. We're not actually building anything that lasts. We're building things that are destined to end in ruins. But do you know what still lasts? The legacy of books like Revelation, the legacy of the writings of the apostles, of the church that they founded, which is continuing to this day. That is our power. That is our strength. It comes not through human might. It comes not through human ingenuity and our architecture and beautiful buildings. It comes through the humble servants of God who live out their lives, representing new creation everywhere they go, and walking as living martyrs, as living witnesses and those who have a testimony to share of how God, who sent his son in love to this world, as the slaughtered lamb, showed us a new way to be human, a way that does not depend on human power, but solely on the power of our self-giving God. So that's what I want to leave you with tonight, because guys, that to me is what John would want us to pay attention to. This story is not over yet. We're still living in the days of the beast, but we know how the story will end. Let's live that end with every day of our lives. Let's pray. Father God, thank you. Thank you for John or whoever wrote this book. Thank you for his willingness to put into words these provocative images that still light our imagination up. Thank you for giving us these warnings, these encouragements, so that we are not left bewildered in a world full of human power, but that we are able to stay true and stay focused entirely on who you have called us to be. I pray, Father, that as we live out this collapse of Christendom in our time, I pray that we would find a way back to what the early church taught us, about the power and the resiliency of a faith that is built on trust. The church of the catacombs, Father, let that be true again. That we can see the gospel spread, not because it is at the end of a sword, but because it is coming from the mouths of those who have given their lives, just like our Savior. So, Father, we trust you, we follow you, and we ask that you would remove from us all of these echoes of imperialism that have so poisoned the well of our faith. Let us be pure and holy yet again as we live out your gospel message into a broken world. We yearn for new creation, and we wait, Father, for your Son to return. So, Father, Maranatha, would he come soon, I pray. Amen. Okay, amen. Thank you. Thank you, guys. That was an awful lot of content, but I really, really appreciate you guys being here, and I hope it was helpful. I hope it was, at the very least, not boring, and it was at least something that you might take and take with you into your reading of Revelation and other books, because there's obviously a lot of crossover. Why don't we end with just at least a few, if there are any questions or final comments or anything that we can just discuss here before we wrap? Yeah. 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 The question is, how is the church able to or going to recapture that simple faith of our fathers, of the apostles? To me, I don't have a short, simple answer to that, because I think that's our generation's task to figure out. Because I think I mentioned in my prayer, I should have said this in the class, I kind of think that Christendom, that idea of Christianity and the power of empire being wedded, I kind of think that time is at an end. It started to die as rationalism and the Enlightenment began to question, Christianity's hold over thought. And then even in more recent years, we've seen that a lot of young people are fleeing the church, even as evangelicals are trying to maintain political power in our country. And it's just like, it feels like we are at the last gasp of Christendom, but we're not at the last gasp of Christianity, which means that we now have an uncharted path ahead of us of what does it look like to, as you said, recapture that faith, that simple faith of our ancestors. I had a very interesting, I can't remember the specifics of it. Recently, I'll just say I've had several interesting moments where I've recognized that, there are people in our midst who literally have no idea who Jesus is. Like, we're in America, and there are people who don't know anything, or they don't know anything about the Bible. They don't know anything. I mentioned the Old Testament in one of my sermons, and someone came up to me and said, do I get a different book for that? Like, which one is that? Like, we are now in a territory where there are genuinely people who do not know anything about our faith, which that's obviously a sad thing for people who have been a part of a very Christian nation or Christianized nation. But I also think it's a significant opportunity. I was just thinking recently about starting a Bible class that I wanted. I was thinking maybe if I could start with a Bible class that is purely for beginners that know nothing. And I don't have to, if I do that class, I don't have to do any deconstruction. I don't have to say, well, you've heard this a lot, but this is actually what it meant. Or I don't have to do any of that because they don't have any background at all. And that got me really excited. It feels like there might be an opportunity to start from scratch with some people in ways that we haven't been able to before, because everybody was coming in with preconceived notions. But I guess my bottom line is I think I don't have a solid answer for you, because I think it's what I plan to spend the next 30 years of my life trying to figure out. I feel like we are now at the very beginning of a turning point, and we have a lot of questions to answer. My hope is that the younger generations are able to discover a kind of powerful faith that is not so tied down with so much of the baggage that we've brought into it. And as they do, I hope and I pray that the older generations will have the courage to listen and to see what the Spirit is doing among people that don't have the same preconceived notions that we do. So totally not an answer to your question, but those are the things I think about when you talk about that question. So we can talk more about it after, but that's really good. What else are you guys thinking or wondering? Sue.
Well, I just hope that, I know you're so busy, but I love when you teach like this, and I love when you come. I hope and pray someday we're in a building, not in a church, some building out in the community where exactly what you're describing is happening, where people who sign up for class
Yeah.
and coming in and getting to hear your amazing analogies and energy and humor and humility and love and passion, all wrapped up in the way you teach, and lives will be changed.
Well, thank you, Sue. Thank you, guys. That's very nice. For the sake of the online audience, Sue just heaped a bunch of praise that was probably unnecessary and uncalled for. But yeah, I share your dream, not just of me. I would love to develop a whole generation of people who are just have the gift of teaching, and that we can kind of unleash them to share the truth and to enlighten a new generation with these truths and bring the Bible to bear. Because I mean, man, just even in my own journey, I didn't almost ever care about the Old Testament until like a decade ago, and now I don't know what my understanding of the Bible would be like if I didn't spend so much time there and things like that. So I would love to just share some of that joy with other people, and I hope I do get more opportunities. So thank you, Sue. That's really encouraging. Yeah. 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 Right. Right. Sure. Yes. Mm-hmm. Yeah. 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 That's awesome. I agree. I totally agree. I won't repeat everything you said, but the crux of it, if I can understand correctly, is just how exciting it is that there are now these new avenues that are doing that deep biblical scholarship, but presenting it in ways that are accessible. I think of the Bible Project as a great example. Their podcast is one of the chief ways that I routinely stay connected to this type of stuff. Tim Mackey, brilliant. I think of him as like a complete kindred spirit. I don't think he knows I exist, but I would love to like meet him someday because he is the kind of biblical scholar who does all the deep dive with all the Bible nerds and then comes back and says, let's go deep together, but in a way that you can grasp. I think he's amazing at it. I want to be like him when I grow up. I also love that people like N.T. Wright are bridging the gap between the New Testament and its world. He literally has a book that just came out called The New Testament and Its World, or In Its World. And I love that he's taking some of the archaeology and the history and helping it make sense of what we're reading in the New Testament in a way that normal people can understand. I feel like, yeah, we're at the beginning of like a lot of great opportunities like that. And I hope I can at least offer like a small contribution into that. So I've been really surprised at how much I've loved the background stuff of this class in particular, specifically the imperial cults. I had no idea. I went on a whim. This is how the Holy Spirit works, I think. On a whim last year, things were really rough, and I needed to get out of town. I had $1,000 of credit with Delta from a flight that got canceled in the past, and I was like, all right, I need to go somewhere in the world. I need to get out. I've got a week. So where could I go? And I thought, well, at one point I thought maybe I'll go check out the ruins of Ephesus someday. And I looked up on Delta's website, how much is a flight to Istanbul? $1,000, like $998. And I was like, okay, free flight. So I booked the flight, went to Ephesus, and it began like what the last year and a half has been, or year and a few months has been an absolute wild roller coaster. I'm literally like doing video calls with archaeologists now because when you take an interest in like that building that they're the expert in, they're like, you want to talk about that? Sure. So like it's a blast. So I'm at the beginning of my journey and I'm having an absolute blast. So, Father.
Not sure you can answer the question completely, but take all of what you talked about the last 4 weeks. Can you imagine graduating that down to students and children? How would you do that?
Wow. How would I take all of what we talked the last 4 weeks?
Take all,
All of every bit of it from the last 4 weeks down to children or students and then children.
especially the Whore of Babylon. That's
The Whore of Babylon, yes, for sure. I think it is possible. I think it's possible. I think it takes a level, kind of some good creativity. I don't think all the details are relevant, but I think there's some like archetypal concepts in what we've been talking about, like power and weakness and sacrifice and selflessness. Like those things can be taught and frankly, the idea of a beast is probably easier to think of than like talking about imperial power for a child. So I think some of these images could be resurrected in a way that would actually be really beneficial for younger people. It'd be an interesting challenge. I'd love to. I would give anything for like a small group of like young adults that are interested in this stuff. I would.
why I said it to you, because I knew you would.
Oh yeah, I'd be all about that. That'd be really fun. I love the well, like in July, we're doing a sermon series called "Explain It Like I'm 5," where we're going to do the same concept basically taught to a 5-year-old, a 15-year-old, and a 50-year-old. Basically, like a teen, a child, and an adult. And so, but we're gonna do like the Trinity. We're gonna talk about like Christ and the Father and the Holy Spirit and us and the church basically, and try to explain like the incarnation to a 5-year-old. I'm pumped. I cannot wait. So, I love that stuff. Yes.
Well, I was just on that line of taking this down to children. I know one of the issues of a lot of children's lives right now are dealing with bullying in
Yeah.
schools.
Yeah.
And I think some of the kids just may be bullies and don't see themselves that way. But this whole idea of being humble and Christ-like,
Hmm.
I think would resonate with a lot of kids on either side of the situation.
I think you're right. And I think it would be especially, for kids that are caught up in the sort of tit for tat retribution thing that they don't realize they wouldn't call it that, but like when someone's mean to you, then you talk trash about them, you're mean to them back, and it makes things worse. Like, I think kids can understand that kind of stuff, even though we think about like loving your enemy as a very deep adult issue. I think it could be really good. And I think kids do probably resonate with concepts of power in a way that it makes more sense in the fantasy world and the fictional world, but could very well, resonate. That's really interesting. Yeah, I love it. Maybe one more, and then we can wrap up here, or two more, or no more. Yeah.
Still kind of thinking about the question about this, getting back to simplicity and things like that. I'm wondering if, like, a lot of the complications, I mean, not all, but, a lot of them have come, I think, from the culture that we're in.
Yeah.
And you think about the fact that Christianity in a lot of ways is declining here and other similar countries, but it's rising in other places, right?
Yeah.
Global South and China and places like that where you wouldn't expect it to necessarily. And I'm just wondering, I mean, I think about like all the amazing people that are here at Grace that are from other parts of the world
Yeah.
like that are maybe kind of already helping us learn that a little bit.
Yeah.
Maybe there's some things we can learn there.
That's a really good observation. Will just mentioned that even though we kind of see Christianity declining in our neck of the woods, the global South, we see significant increases in it. I think of rural India as a great example where there are massive, we're talking like millions of people becoming Christ followers, and nobody knows about it here because it's, I don't know, a tiny fraction of the number of people who live there, but it's actually a massive movement. And I think, we have a lot to learn. One of the gifts in my life has been the ability to actually sit at the feet of global leaders of the church that are not people of renown, and be able to hear from them. And you're right, we do have now, the world is coming to Grace. We have this class translated into Spanish. Good job, Elizabeth. I mean, it's an amazing step in that direction, and I completely agree. Yeah, we've got lots to learn from those where the church is thriving. Yeah. Yeah.
You've mentioned a couple of times about places and times when the church really thrived,
Yeah.
did thrive, and did spread because it was under persecution.
Mm-hmm.
And I really think sometimes that as we looked at current culture and kind of bemoan the pushback and the marginalization of traditional Christianity and the culture today, I wonder when I look at that if that comes to more of a feeling of persecution,
Mm-hmm.
if that doesn't then spark a resurgence of a baseline faith that is meaningful.
Sure.
I think that perhaps God is preparing the soil
Hmm.
for us to look at that more closely and
Sure.
spread it in a new way.
Barb is mentioning the possibility that as we see some greater opposition to the church in our culture, that maybe that is God preparing the soil for us to experience a bit more of that persecution, which could then be a catalytic movement for the church. I think it's definitely possible, although in our context, I always ask this question when it comes to questions of like opposition to the church, and it's, are they opposed to the gospel, or are they opposed to us being jerks? And if they're opposed to us being jerks, I don't think it's persecution. I think it's probably justified. So we have to like do some significant soul searching and find out what are people actually against, And like, for example, there were people, Tim Ayers always tells this story. He's one of our teaching pastors. If you're not, most of you were in his class, you know who Tim Ayers is, of like a neighbor that he was talking to who would never be caught dead in a church. And Tim one day asked him like, well, what do you think churches should be doing in this world? And he listed off, caring for the poor and the marginalized. They should help out families with disabled children. He listed off all these things, which like our church is doing, but the reputation of Christians in our culture has made it so that man who thinks that this is what a church should be doing, it will keep him from ever coming inside our doors. And so that's where it gets so muddy. And I'm like, I feel like our gospel would not be offensive. It might actually be very attractive if it was somehow rid of all the stigma that comes because Christians have been jerks. And that's the credibility gap that I feel like we've got lots of work to do to figure out how to bridge. But yeah, you're right. I think, I hate to say it, but there are times when I wish that we experienced a bit of persecution, because I think it would really separate the wheat from the chaff, and it would really make people take their faith seriously. If I'm going to suffer for this, am I really willing to be on this boat? So I, broadly speaking, I think perhaps that is where things will head, and who knows, but God knows, and He's got us in His hands. Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. It adds value to our faith. I agree. All right, friends, I have talked your ear off for 4 weeks. You deserve a break. I deserve a break. Let's all just go take a break. All right? This is awesome. I love you all. Thank you for sticking with me for 4 weeks. We'll do this again sometime. All right? See ya. Thank you.